in here, and off to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's really nice to be here. It's nice also that there's a really solid turnout, which is awesome. So I am first and foremost, I'm not going to use the full 2 hours. I'm thinking this presentation will probably be around an hour. So we'll kind of see, how we're doing, throughout. So again, so my name is Jared Fishman. I'm a history teacher at the Hackley School in Tarrytown, New York. I entitled this presentation, Why Games Work, Role-Playing Games and Simulations as an Educational Tool. I'm also the co-founder of an organization called HMGS Next Gen. And one of the things I'll point out immediately is this presentation is a little bit more broad than I normally would do, but I think broad works in this situation. What I really want to try to do is show how the kind of stuff we do in our classrooms and I do in my classroom here, and what we do in our game club and what we are going to try to do with Next Gen, I kind of want to show how all of that sort of connects. And later on, as our sort of relationship grows with you guys, with your own organization, maybe we can come in and do some more specific things. So I guess we'll start. Bear with me for 1 second. I'm just realizing that I may need to bear with me for 1 sec. All right. I was just having an issue changing the slides, so again, bear with me for a second. Sorry about that, everyone. All right, let me see. There we go. I think that should work. All right, beautiful. There we go. Okay, so why don't I start with just a little bit about who I am. I'll try to keep this part brief. I started teaching in the early 2000s. My initial intention in education was to be a history professor, which I did for a little while. But ultimately, what I sort of found was that the doctorate path was not necessarily for me. I mean, there were things I enjoyed about it, but I really wanted to be in a secondary education classroom. So I ended up finding Hackley in a very, very random way. So Hackley is a independent school. It's K through 12 in Tarrytown, New York. And I randomly came across it because one of the people I was working with at Iona happened to know some people at Hackley. And they sort of said to me, that would be a really interesting place for you to sort of work at, given your sort of background and acumen when it comes to like history and research and things like that. And the fact that like they kind of knew some things about me, they knew a little bit about sort of my background in gaming and stuff like that. And independent schools tend to really like people like that. So again, in a very sort of like random way, I interviewed quickly because a position opened up over the summer. And sure enough, I landed the job and I've basically been here ever since. So I've been at this school for quite a while. I've been, teaching lots of different things here. So I've taught 6th grade history, 7th grade history, 9th grade history. And I also teach a number of what we call minors here. And those minors, which we'll talk a little bit about later, have a really nice sort of gaming component to it. I did hold a chair in history for a period of time here, voted by my colleagues and then given that sort of promotion by the administration. So I've had a very, very good experience here at the school. I want to talk a little bit about some of my background in gaming. So this is a huge part of my life, as I would assume many of the people that are here listening to this presentation are as well. So I've been playing miniature war games and role playing and card games and things like that since I'm really young, like since I was like, basically like in the early 90s. And I've been a member of the Historical Miniature Gaming Society since then as well. I got into gaming because of my father. He was a gamer in the 70s, and it's like anything else. When you have a son or a daughter, or whoever, sometimes your parents will try to get you into the same things that they're into. So in my case, I've been around, especially miniature gaming, from I would say 4th grade and 5th grade on. And I like gaming enough to the point where when I became a teacher, I sort of said to myself, how do I want to try to bring this part of my life into education? And I did see immediate value in being in a classroom and using gaming as essentially like a tool to help students learn. So as my career has gone on, I have sort of got to the point where I'm running conferences for teachers on really how to do that and trying to show teachers the sort of value in using games in the classroom. And all of that sort of culminated in something that I'm going to talk about at the end of this presentation, something that I helped found and something I'm helping direct called HMGS Next Gen, which is kind of an initiative that's trying to take some of what's been done at Hackley as well as some other schools that HMGS members know of. And we're going to try to take some of these models and kind of branch them out into other schools and other avenues. So what are my goals for tonight's programming? So what I'd like to do over this course of an hour or so, I would like to illustrate how I and some others here at Hackley integrate game-based learning into not just the history curriculum, but curriculum in general. I want to talk about some of the benefits that I've seen personally as a teacher, but also some of the benefits from the perspective of students and parents and administrators about why all of this is such a great thing. And I'll point out quickly that Hackley really has embraced this kind of learning as long as I've been here, and also even before I've been here, and that's something super important. Hackley has always really kind of looked at games in a great way, and I've just sort of accentuated given my background. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Hackley Game Club, this monthly club that we have here. And finally, as I mentioned before, talk a little bit about Next Gen. And again, why so broad? Because I think that all of these points connect with one another. And the central through line, which I'll read verbatim here, games are a powerful tool that have the potential to benefit institutions inside and outside the classroom or the workplace. And when I use that phrase workplace, I'll kind of get into that towards the end when we're talking a little bit about professional development. So again, this is just more of just the flow of how things are going to go. So I can kind of just, move through that. So the first thing that we'll talk about is exactly what I mean by integrating games into the classroom. By the way, most of the images that you'll see here are by actual students over the years. So these just happen to be some of my sixth graders from last year. So let's talk, I guess, about my own sort of personal goals as a teacher and what I'm sort of looking for beyond like thinking about games. So when I think about teaching somebody history, really the four big things that I think about are engagement, getting students to really sort of buy into and engage with and really live with the kind of material that we're covering. And just so everybody's aware, like I teach lots of different things. So sixth grade was more focused on European and Middle Eastern history. Seventh grade is focused more on Asian history and particularly West African history as well. So both of those regions. And then the ninth grade has some similarities to both of those, but obviously, given that the students are older, we go a little bit more in depth. Reading comprehension is super important. Making sure that the students understand how to read primary sources and secondary sources. Writing is also another important goal for me as a teacher. I want my students at the end of each school year to really be able to put together a well-organized piece of writing. So whether that's a basic body paragraph when you're in sixth grade versus like a short research paper when you're in ninth grade. And finally, verbal skill is really important. I want my students to kind of have the confidence and have the ability to be able to share their opinions and their ideas and their musings about all the different things that we're sort of looking at. And I want my students to feel that way and have that sort of confidence, whether it's a low stakes sort of activity where we're just having a basic discussion, or more high stakes where the kids might be having a debate or they might be doing a presentation on something that they've learned. Now, what are the traditional means to achieve those goals? So generally speaking, like if you go back to even like the first philosophers that were writing about what education should look like, we're thinking about discussions and note-taking, guided questions. So for example, the kids get a reading and teacher designs questions to sort of go with it. Essay writing, especially building more towards like research the older the students get. In terms of assessment, we're talking about tests and quizzes. And I also put projects here because, believe it or not, some institutions look at projects as being, some look at it as being traditional and others don't. So it kind of depends on the sort of school you're at, but I still use the word here, both short-term and long-term projects where the kids get a task at the beginning of that project and there's some sort of goal that they sort of need to get to, by the end. So here's the deal, like, and it's an important question, and it's something I always talk about in conferences. Is there something wrong with traditional education? No, not necessarily. I love this image. This is an image of some Chinese teachers and Chinese students during the Sung Dynasty, so during the Middle Ages. And in a lot of ways, like, this is a very sort of traditional sort of mode of learning, and a lot of our classrooms, even today, sort of look like this. There's nothing wrong with tests. There's nothing wrong with quizzes and reading comprehension and all of that. So where does gaming fit in? Here's sort of how I see it. When I think about classrooms that have games that are sort of integrated in them, what I will often tell people is that when we're talking about game-based lessons or units or even like whole curriculum programs, students are basically learning the same skills. They're learning the same material. And generally, they're doing it in a potentially more engaging way, a more dynamic way, a more exciting way, a more immersive way. So for example, this image here, you're not really seeing desks here. You're seeing students who are getting ready to play a game about the Napoleonic era. You can see an HMGS member, in the background, sort of watching the students. And I don't see why something like this can't be replicated with lots of different kinds of games in a regular classroom setting. So this was something from our game club, but ultimately, I've noticed over the years that gaming promotes diversity of thought. It promotes teamwork and leadership. And ultimately, what I come back to a lot is the students really buy into their work when they're gaming. And often they don't even realize they're really working. And finally, and in a way, you could almost put this up at the top, it's fun. Education should be fun. And I have found in my career that using games to kind of get to the same sort of skills that students are it's really necessary for them to learn, doing it in a fun way is definitely possible, and games can make it possible. Right. So what I want to sort of get into now is give you some examples. I'm not going to go into every single detail, but I want to kind of talk a little bit about the kinds of games that you might see in the Hackley curriculum, meaning if you come to our school and go to any kind of classroom, for the teachers that really embrace gaming, and there are many, these are the kinds of things that you'll see. And then I'll give you some really specific examples of games from my own classroom. So here are the kinds of things that you might find. Role playing is a big thing here at Hackley, okay? So whether it's an English classroom or a classics classroom or a math classroom, what teachers will sometimes do is ask the kids to role play. They'll ask them to embody some kind of fictional character for a purpose and within a particular setting to kind of get them to kind of come out of their shoes and put themselves into the body of somebody else, which, as you'll sort of see, it gives students a chance to think about things from a different sort of perspective, which is really important at this school. Another really sort of typical kind of game are historical simulations. That's what I probably have the most experience with here at the school. So what we mean by historical simulations is when students are taking an active role in a simulated real life historical event or moment. So in these cases, players will often play caricatures of real people. Sometimes they might actually be playing a real person. So just as an example, I've seen lots of these here. There have been sort of simulations about the Crusading era during the Middle Ages. There have been simulations about American politics and things like that. So the students taking on roles within those simulations and really kind of like almost living the experience as opposed to just reading about it. Now, some of the more common games that I would say are actually more like review games. So teachers here will often play Jeopardy and board games, card-based games, and things like that to review for tests and things like that. It's in the same wheelhouse as role-playing historical simulations, but again, it's not exactly the same thing. Usually those are much more short, whereas for role-playing simulations, historical simulations, those sometimes can, take up a few class periods. And last but not least, and this is more specific to my own class on military history, which I'll get to towards the end, are miniatures games, where we will literally set up miniature battlefields in the classroom, and we will use different kinds of rules in order to simulate what kinds of tactics and strategies were being used in a particular conflict. Finally, and this is something that I wouldn't go as far as to say is done in every classroom, but in the history department in particular, we do a lot of game design as well. These are two of my 7th graders from a couple of years ago, where what they're doing is they're going beyond just playing a game. They literally design their own games. And I'll give you an example of what they're doing a little bit later. I'll talk you through what the project looked like. But ultimately, they could be designing games for lots of different reasons. It could be about their sort of own knowledge or skills that we're working on, or games meant to help somebody understand whatever topic the game's about. So what I'd like to do now is go through some example games. And this is where, if there's something that doesn't make sense or there's something you want more information about, you can certainly put it in the chat and we can get to it at the end. Some of these games are so in depth that it would just take too long to explain every single nuance of them. But I do want to kind of give you a sense of what, some of these simulations look like. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. My favorite, unfortunately, is a little bit marred now, given everything that's going on with the pandemic. But then again, I did make a joke with some of my students that actually have graduated before or graduated already from Hackley that's played this game. And they sort of joke with me about maybe they need to go to Washington, D.C. and talk about some of the things they did in this simulation, and maybe the government should, take some notes on it, which I find hysterical. It's called the Black Death simulation, okay? And this is part of the 6th grade curriculum where, we're studying the Middle Ages and they learn about, what this time period was like. So here's a traditional way of sort of doing this. And I've done this before, and I will often do assignments like this in conjunction with the game. So in a traditional sense, students would come into the room, they might read a primary source like Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron about, the plague and what it was like. Read a secondary source, Merchants of Death, which again, is more of a textbook reading about the time period. I might design guided questions to sort of go with it. We'll discuss those answers, and then we'll have some form of assessment at the end. So in this case, it might be some paragraph writing. There's nothing wrong with this. Kids, if you've got a great teacher, kids can get into this, and no matter which Hackley teacher is doing this kind of lesson, they're going to get into it. However, early in my career, this was one of the first simulations that I designed. What I decided to do was I said to myself, what if we take all of these concepts and put it into the context of a game and have the students learn all of the same material, but really have fun doing it. So this particular class had, last year played the simulation. So let me give you a sense of what it's like. So what we do is we pair the students up, and basically they choose a region in Italy. So for example, choosing Messina or Lombardy or Tuscany or wherever. And what they need to do over the course of several class periods is they need to sort of research these regions. They need to learn a little bit about the history of the region, what the geography is like, what landmarks are there. And there's a particular emphasis on the Middle Ages. Now, by the way, I should point out, they don't necessarily know what the game is about yet. They just know that they've got to do this research. So once they have a sense of what this area is like, then they start to learn a little bit about what the game is going to sort of entail. So they've got to design a historically accurate town from the region. And what they do is they build it up in a written sense where they do a write-up about what the town looks like. They do an assignment on the history of the town where they've got to take what they've learned about the medieval period and their region and build a history that would convince their parents it's real. That's what I will often tell them. Like, go home and talk to them about this place and see if you can convince them that it's actually a real, town that you could visit at some point. They also do it in a visual sense as well, where they draw some pictures of buildings and they've got artifacts. They make images of what the people look like, and they make a bird's eye view of a map of what the place looks like. And what they then have to do is they have to present these towns to our class. So again, it's really, taking all of the things that they would be learning about anyway, and now what they're doing is they're really taking ownership over the material. Then what they're told is that a time traveler has shown up in their town with information about this plague that's coming. And they are then asked to role play as leaders in this town that they've created. They know this plague is coming. And they know what it's capable of because they've already done all of the work previously about what the play is. And what they basically have to do is they have to come up with a set of laws that would protect their town from the illness. They have to sit together as little pairs, and they have to say, okay, do we want quarantining rules? Do we want medical exams? Do we want specific places in the town where plague victims have to go? And they have to design all of these different laws. And again, they have to deliver a presentation where they pretend that we're all these sort of audience members. And they come up in front of the room and they explain these laws, explain why the laws are in place, and why they're trying to protect everyone. Now, again, without getting into the nitty-gritty, there are game mechanics that go with this, where, for example, when they do their presentation, I, as the sort of GM, assign them what's called a starting number based on how well their presentation was put together and how sensical and sensible their laws are. And then once all those numbers are sort of assigned and once the laws are done, we play a simulation. And what the simulation does is it represents 5 months of time, with each turn basically representing a month. And to make a long story short, the players every single month get a scenario that they have to respond to, where they basically have to role play. And depending on what their response is and a little bit of luck and what their starting number is, what they eventually have to do based on all of that is roll a number of D20s, and then whatever the sum is equates to how many play cases they have that month. And it becomes kind of a competition where the students are running through these scenarios, and obviously the goal is they want to have the least amount of plague cases in their town as possible. So just as an example, one of the scenarios that they always get to sort of start is right here. So 40 merchants arrive at the gates to your town. They demand entry, as there are numerous goods they'd like to sell in your marketplace. What do you say to them and why? So what the kids would have to do is they would have to sit and they would be kind of pondering how to respond to this. And then once they have a response, they write it out and they read it. And then they are assigned their numbers based on, their number of D20s based on how strong of an answer they had. So in this case, if you're looking at this answer, these students clearly did their research. They know that it's a terrible idea to have these merchants come into the village. Now, let's say they had an opposite response. Let's say they didn't pay attention to that particular lesson and they're like, okay, yeah, you can come in and set up, but we have to have a couple of rules and regulations. The likelihood that plague is going to spread is greatened, right? So this is an example of a kind of game that we would sort of use. Now, I'll give you two more. And again, I'm just looking at the time. Remember, I want to try to be done by 7. So, because I don't want to necessarily droll on and on and on. I just want you guys to have a sense of sort of how some of this works. Here's a second example. Now, this is in one of my gaming specific classes called Topics in the History of Warfare. So here's the topic at hand is Clausewitzian theory. So Clausewitz, the great military theorist who wrote the text on war. So here's kind of a traditional way to sort of, do a lesson like this or do a unit like this. So you give out a series of quotes from the text because they're not going to have enough time to read the whole thing, right? And what they've got to do is digest those quotes as a class and create a PowerPoint presentation where they have to come up with the 10 commandments of Clausewitz, meaning of everything that they read, how could they boil things down to 10 central themes that Clausewitz was talking about in his text. Then what we do is they do a presentation where they present that information. Then I do one back and we sort of compare our notes and see what we sort of, learned. And then what they could then do is, given that we've already studied the Napoleonic era, what they would then do is do a short written response where they apply Clausewitz's theories to the Napoleonic era, right? Again, nothing wrong with that. Kind of traditional, and they're still going to meet a lot of learning goals, and they're going to, broaden their knowledge and learn skills and all of that. What if we take it to the next level and add some gaming? I don't know how many of you are familiar with diplomacy. It is an amazing game, and diplomacy is great in the classroom. I cannot take credit for obviously inventing this. This game has been around forever. And there are Hackley teachers that have been using this game forever. This map was something that I had specifically made for the year 1800, so sort of going back in time to the Napoleonic era. And as you can see here on this map, you have different sort of empires and states that are all over the map, and the kids would basically take on, governing roles in those places. So what we would basically be shooting for with this game, and it just so happens that we're playing this right now, we've got the students divided in pairs representing 6 different nations. They're all representing real people from the era. So what they're going to do, and what they're doing right now, is they're writing bios about who they're representing in the game. They also have to come up with a foreign policy and make a video to me explaining what those goals actually are. So as an example, the Spanish, right? Here, they would need to write a foreign policy. Maybe their foreign policy is, we want to have a good relationship with the British, and we want to conjoin with them and put pressure on France. And every group is going to do something along those lines. And what I'm specific about with them is, how can you take what you learned about Clausewitz's theories about the ways in which war and politics intermingle and how they play off of each other? And the idea would be for the students to try to see what they can learn about Clausewitz and what they can apply in the game itself. I also added some other mechanisms to the game. So normally the way the game works is, it's really just all about these little armies that you have and supply centers. And the idea is, whichever state takes over the most supply centers essentially wins. What I added was a resources system, where the kids get playing cards that represent all different types of resources. And the idea is that those resources will have a implication on the game itself. They can use them to make deals. They can spend them to get certain buffs and modifiers when they're actually playing the game, in terms of like invading places and things like that. And I think the most fun part of this project is going to be when the students actually create a presentation where they determine on their own whether they actually succeeded at their foreign policy. So how did the events of the game mirror what they wanted to sort of accomplish, and what they learned from the simulation? So that's gonna, come sort of at the end. These are just some images of some of my students, so you can kind of see that this was actually taken very recently, where you can see the students have placed their armies and fleets on the board, and they just sort of get right into it. And again, I haven't talked necessarily yet about what I've seen from my students in using kind of lessons like this. But you can sort of tell, even just by looking at them, they just really get invested. It's one thing for me to kind of get up there and blather on about Clausewitz. It's another for them to take those theories, and now immediately they're involved in something beyond just turning an assignment in. Like, they want to win and they want to have a fun experience. So it just makes everything a little bit more digestible. I think that's a good word to use. And again, so these are just a few more images of my classroom and the kids sort of plotting out, all of their different ideas. This image here is from a few years ago. So this is another Hackley teacher, Vladimir Klemenko, where he's getting ready to run 3 different diplomacy games as part of our summer program. So it's a very sort of popular game at this school. The last example I want to give of a game that I've used in my own classroom, in a traditional sort of classroom, is a game about the Japanese shogunate from the Middle Ages. So this is from 7th graders essentially doing this project. So again, traditional way. Students form some study teams, and we use a textbook called TCI book, and there are 3 different chapters on Japan. And in a very traditional sort of sense, what you could have the students do, and what I've had them do in the past, is you break them up into these teams, and every student in these different groups has a responsibility from the chapter. It might be they have to make assessment questions. They might have to design a short response question. Somebody might have to take notes. Somebody might have to put the Google Slides presentation together. So it's all very group-based. And we then jigsaw. And what happens is, you send all of the different students with different responsibilities, you mingle all the groups together, and you do this a few times. And what they do is they take the things that they've learned or designed and they give it to other students to work on. Obviously with teacher help to sort of make sure that their questions are strong and their notes are strong and things like that. So they would go through all of that material, get all of that work done, and then what would happen is in the end, we would do something called a museum walk or a gallery walk, where they produce either a Google Slides type of presentation, or in the past, we've actually gone really old school and used those trifolds that you would use for a science presentation or a science, I know the word's not coming to me right now, but like a, like a science fair actually kind of thing. And then the students can actually go and see all of this work that everybody, had completed. And then they get a chance to discuss all of the different things that they realized as they were doing the work. Again, this is a very solid assignment, and you do get a lot of student buy-in. But what if you pair it with a game, or what if you take those elements and put it into the context of game design? So this is specifically a game design project. What the students are asked to do, and you can see them doing this here. What they're asked to do is they're asked to pick the thing from their assigned chapter that they liked the most or that they found the most interesting and engaging, and they are asked to design a game around it. Not just a game, but a rule book, a historical background section, author's notes on like their really personal feelings on why they made the game. And what they would then do in order to learn how to do this design element is they bring some games in from home. We have some lessons on what makes Monopoly interesting, what makes the game of life interesting. What kinds of mechanics do these games use? And as they're sort of learning about all these different types of games that are very familiar, they would then sort of take it and then take some of those sort of skills and put it into their own. So it's a really fun activity because you can see kids, they're designing their own boards, they're designing their own rules. They bring materials from outside of school into the classroom and sort of reappropriate them to make it work for their sort of game. When we do this kind of project, we have to talk about math. We have to talk about skills that you would not normally see in a history classroom, which again, like I'll talk more about school administrators a little bit later, but they love this sort of thing, right? Interdisciplinary work, taking things from all of your different classes and kind of bringing it all together into one setting. Also, a really fun element of this project is where the students actually play test this, and you can see them getting frustrated in a good way, getting stressed in a good way, where they really want a student to get something from their game, but the mechanic might not be working. And then what my job is, given my background in game design, is to sit with them and kind of help them and say, okay, well, are dice going to be the best, option for you with this mechanic? What type of die? Is it better to use a D4 or is it better to use a D20? So just little things like that. And they finalize their games. And then eventually what we have, and this is probably my favorite picture because I vividly remember the kids so getting into this. It was a game about different Japanese philosophies, and you sort of move around the board, learning different elements of religions and philosophies and things like that. And bad things can happen if you get some stuff wrong about the philosophies. You can end up kind of heading back to the beginning. But yeah, they get to sort of play test the games. They get to play the games with one another. They get feedback from a Q&A. And then to end the project, we sort of asked them, like, what if a second edition was going to come out? What kinds of changes would you make to make the game better after everything is said and done? So these are all examples of games that are used in very sort of traditional classes, meaning, every sixth grader has to take sixth grade history. Now, there's a couple of gaming specific classes here. The reason I put this in is not necessarily because of the fact that myself, my teaching partner, won an award, but rather I just wanted to show you who this other person is. So this is Mike Canarino. He is one of the people at Hackley that I'm most in connection with in terms of developing games. So this was, a moment where we went to a conference in Chicago, run by an organization called Nasaga, where we ran a game that we use here at school, and we ran it for adults and other professionals and things like that. So what are some of these? And again, without being too long-winded, and by the way, again, I can't even see your faces right now because I've got the screen full-sized. again, like I hope I'm not drolling too on and on and on about any particular topic. I'm looking at the time, it's 6:37, so I think we're in good shape. So again, without going into every gory detail, Mike and I teach a course called Collaborative Storytelling and Roleplay Gaming. This is a very revolutionary class in terms of Hackley because it's the first class that is specifically taught through the lens of games, meaning everything we do. The cards that we're using for our world building activities, these cards were made by somebody named Trent Hergenrader. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him, but he is an English professor in Rochester who designed these cards to be used for people that play games like D&D in order to build their own sort of worlds in a very organic way. So this is Mike, doing a lesson on how to use these cards for our students. So talking a little bit about this class, the short version is that what we do is we've created together a fictional world, a fantasy world set in a D&D type environment. And that's the rule set that we use in the course. And what we do is we play a fictional game that's based on specific literary moments and specific historical moments. And what we have the students do is we have them compare what they're seeing and learning in the game to the things that they're learning in some of their other classes. And it's important to point out that this is a minor class. So that means the students that take this, of our 6 class periods within a 7-day rotation, they only meet on 3 of those days. So it's all voluntary. So they really want to be here. So usually we have anywhere between 8 and 10 students. Most of the assignments that they do are through the lens of their characters. Some of them are more about a 360 view, meaning they step out of the shoes of their character and they look at the whole sort of situation as a student. And again, the game is designed to parallel things that are going on either in the real world or in literary books. And just as some examples, like what we're playing right now. So again, try to picture this. Every class period, the kids basically play D&D, where Mike and I are running games for them. And what we decided was, given everything that's sort of going on in the world, we're looking at US Reconstruction, we're looking at freedom and anti-freedom, we're looking at slavery, we're looking at political conferences and what those look like. So the kids are role-playing in scenarios that look like these things. So for example, they play a game in which they run into a runaway slave from a particular town. And in the D&D setting, they get to sort of hear about the experience of this person. And they decide what to do. Like, do we want to free this person? Do we want to march on the town that this person is from and investigate why such an appalling thing still exists? They might look at why this appalling thing exists in this town. And then what we're able to do is take these really difficult conversations, which the kids find easier to have in the context of a game, and then we're able to take those and say, where else do you see these kinds of things happening? And that gives us a chance to talk about US history, history of the world, things like that. And every campaign that we run has a particular theme to it. So that's what we do in that class. And finally, the last class that I want to talk about is a class that I teach on my own called Topics in the History of Warfare. This is my class from last year. We got some special tickets to go see a screening of 1917. And it's sort of bittersweet and sad to look at this image just because this was very, very shortly before the pandemic hit. So no one's masked up. We had a great time, a great group of kids. And what I'd like to talk about is just some of the things that we do. So what we look at in this course, and I think this is probably the course that's most connected to military wargaming, which I know, is something huge at Georgetown. What we look at is the development of warfare from basically linear tactics in the 1700s all the way up to the First World War. And generally speaking, what our goal is to see why World War I was fought the way that it was in those first few months. You'll also often hear people criticize generals from this period and say, why would they march in lines against machine guns? And ultimately, what we try to do in the course is answer that question. And we have to go all the way back to Frederick the Great in order to really answer. So there's a real specific emphasis on tactical and strategic evolution, war's impact on society, the theories behind why wars are fought, and gaming is a really integral component to this. So we've played all sorts of miniatures games. And by the way, this is the same class that we've also played diplomacy in. So what we do is we set up miniatures games that sort of connect to the different topics we're doing. So just as an example, earlier in the year, I set up both of these tables. These were miniatures battles using a rule set called Bloody Big Battles, which is a really sort of great rule set written by an author named Chris Pringle. So what we did was, before we started really diving too deeply into this campaign, I just had them play games on it. And what was unbelievable to me, and I'll get to this more towards the end of the presentation, when I think about what the students learned, they honestly learned just as much by moving these pieces around the board compared with any reading that I gave them after the fact. So they learned how cavalry was used. They learned why artillery could be so potent. They learned the sort of difficulties of terrain on a battlefield and how that can impact how a battle flows. So it was, even for me who has a background in this, and I've done this before, it's still pretty astounding when students are able to learn all of this just by rolling some dice and by playing a scenario. So this part of the presentation was really all about thinking about how games are used. Now, here's my general perspective. And I would also argue for the teachers at Hackley that have used games in the classroom, this is a general perspective on what I've heard, what I've seen, over the years. The biggest thing that I definitely notice is all of the same skills that are used in a traditional setting get practiced and honed in a game setting. So all of the writing, all of the verbal stuff that we talked about earlier, like in terms of my own goals as a teacher, all of that can be built into a game. Even assessment, something like a test, can be built into the end of a game. I have always found that you get more buy-in, more engagement from students when things are gamified. So again, even with my topics in the history of warfare students, the day before a break where they might not be in the best sort of place to learn because they're high school students, the second that you take what you were going to do and gamify it, all of a sudden it becomes different. And they have told me this before. It feels almost like they're not working when they're doing these kinds of games or playing these kinds of games. And what I know is that they're actually most of the time working harder. Their brains are working harder because ultimately they want to play well. They want to know what they need to do in order to play well. And they know that they need to know information in order to do well. So I find that they get much more engaged, much more buy-in. I find that you build camaraderie in a game setting. The kids, the students get closer by being in these sort of fictional role-playing situations or historical simulations. They get excited about this. They have an immediate desire to know things, meaning the second that saving your village is on the line, like in our Black Death simulation, everything about the plague becomes more important. And it goes beyond just getting a good grade. They don't really care about the test at the end. What they care about is having the right kinds of laws to save their people. And I have seen that at a very young age, so kids that are in 6th grade and 7th grade, as well as students that are in high school. Now, I will see if this will work, if everybody bears with me for a second. I had a little bit of a glitch at the very beginning of this. Years ago, even though it wasn't that long ago, 2 years ago, one of our teachers made a little video where students actually talked about their experiences playing. So I'm just going to see if this will work. So bear with me for one moment. All right. I know that most of you are probably muted, but if for some reason this doesn't play or you can't hear it, just feel free to shout out and let me know. I've got my volume up as high as I can. So this is just a short video. I probably am not going to show you the whole thing. And also keep in mind, these are really young kids. So, we're going to be seeing in some cases 5th graders, 6th graders, and 7th graders kind of talking a little bit about games, and then some older students that are in upper school. So it's a pretty endearing video, especially for me, because some of the kids that are in this video from a few years ago are now in the upper school and still taking some of my classes. So let's see if this works. I hope it does. So let's see.
By like simulating, you're kind of like put within what the actual game is, not that it's, you're just playing a game in class.
Learning something through a PowerPoint can be so foreign, whereas like playing a game, like really putting yourself in that situation, is I think the only way that I've ever really been able to like really like put myself in the shoes of someone who is like living in any given time period.
I played the plague simulation, and we were on a boat, and we had just found out that one of our crewmates got sick, and like when we found out that he was sick, we all tried to move away from him. And I just like the realism because we were all like bunched together just in a tiny room. It was dark, and you could also like hear the music, and I just learned a lot from that too.
Earlier this year in 7th grade, we played a Quiet Year, and our goal was to simulate like what a successful civilization, like what kind of geographical landforms they would need, like desert, is it good or bad, like what benefits and stuff.
In 5th grade, I played a simulation where you were each in ancient times, and you had to conquer all the other civilizations, and we got to experience like kind of how it would be.
In 6th grade, we played a Black Death simulation game where we rolled die, and that was like how many people, I guess, died in our game. And we had to try to keep our village, our made-up villages alive. We had several stages. First, we designed our own town, and we made a map of the geography of our town. And then we started playing the game. We were asked a question, and we would have about 5 to 10 minutes to write a response. And then we would read our response, and we would roll the die and see how many people died. And then Mr. Fishman would also roll the die, and we would see if any of us caught the plague. It taught me about what's really important to our town. What will the long-term effects be if I pick this? How will that change what's going to happen to the future of my town?
Generally, any battles you look at, you learn a lot more about the historical context of them and sort of the nuances of all the decisions that go into fighting a war or a specific battle. I can safely say I've learned more about like British occupation of Middle Eastern countries like Afghanistan, far more from playing simulations than I ever had in history class.
We ended up losing the game on a dice roll, which and it sticks with me today, 7 years later, because and ultimately the takeaway was, of course, that there's nothing you could really do to stop the bubonic plague. It was just hygiene wasn't good enough. But that sticks with me today in a way that a PowerPoint wouldn't have.
We simulated a samurai kind of card game, and it kind of put us in the shoes of how samurai warriors fought and the strategies that they used, and help us kind of relive how they fought, and helped us learn the history of that.
So I'm going to freeze it there. And again, you can kind of see the point that sort of made that always sticks out to me when I watch that video is the student that talks about what they sort of remember. Because ultimately that's what's really important, right? What do you sort of remember, years beyond? I find that games are a great way to trigger memory. And again, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a teacher, but from what I've seen over the years from students, it's pretty amazing what they remember. So at this point, I'm just checking the time. So it's 6:51. We're about 3/4 of the way through the presentation. What I'm gonna now do is talk about some of these other tangential programs that are related to some of the things that we do in our classroom. I will talk about the Hackley Game Club, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about what Next Gen is. So Hackley Game Club, what you can sort of see here, this is my old classroom from a few years ago. What you can sort of see here is a medieval siege. The Hackley Game Club has existed since roughly 2008. We've gone strong really since then. It began life as an after-school program, but it really did grow into something sort of much, much broader. We have technically 3 different clubs. We have 6th graders that game together, 7th and 8th graders that game together, and then upper school students that game together. We meet usually once a month. Things have been difficult because of COVID, but ultimately, when we do meet, we play miniatures games, board games, card games. Every year there's one really sort of big battle game or really sort of big set piece sort of activity where we get all of the sort of members of the club, anybody who wants to come, and we just all play the same thing. We also have a pretty active role-playing club run by a teacher named Emma Olson here who teaches science. She's really big into role-playing, and she has about 10 students or so that, again, meet once a month to play. And lastly, in terms of what encompasses this club, we have a summer program, which usually hosts 30 to 40 students over the course of 3 weeks. And this, I can honestly say, is probably the most fun element of working at the school. I'm very privileged. I use that word a lot when it comes to my job. I run miniatures games for 3 weeks, and I'm compensated for it, which always sort of makes me stop and think about how lucky I am in terms of where my life has gone. We play all sorts of different miniatures games. Sometimes we have a theme, like where maybe we want to learn more about the Middle Ages, so we sort of set up different games over the course of that week to help them learn about that material, and so on and so forth. There are some pictures here that I can sort of show you. So these are some game club members, again, with Mr. Klemenko playing a board game about the American Revolution. We've got some students here, and I love this photo too. You've got students in the upper school on one side that are teaching the younger students about what Rorke's Drift was, during the Zulu War of 1879. Also, what's really cool about this image is that those students, at least 2 of them, did an independent study with me where we studied that conflict essentially for a year. And they painted the miniatures with me. We built all the terrain together. We set everything up with the express purpose of showing it to the younger students. This is an image of some Crusades battles in 15mm scale. This is one of those big battles where we actually did Borodino, which was fought in September 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars. Again, it's a little bit hard to see, but that was an 18-foot-long table where we played in our chapel on campus. This school was founded by Unitarians, and this tends to be the space that we game the most in. This is a really good friend of mine, Mike Patorti, who is another teacher at a school nearby. He is running a role-playing game, a D&D game for some of our younger students at the time. He often recollects, what this game was like and kind of how wild it was. And all of these students here still do play to this day. They're much older now, so these students, I think, are, my memory serves me right, there in 11th grade. So yeah, you guys kind of get the idea. In terms of the impact on school culture that I found with gaming is very much normal. Now, again, it is so weird. I keep saying this because I can't see your faces. If I was in person, obviously, and we were all in the same room, we'd probably be discussing this together as opposed to, again, me just sort of talking. But I don't know about all of you, but gaming was not a normal thing when I was growing up. So, I mean, I was in grade school in the 90s. Not many people played miniature war games. If you played D&D, you were strange and odd. And the thing I'm most proud of is the fact that it's not odd here. I have found athletes, artists, thinkers, kids from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds, and they use gaming as an outlet here. So whether it's in their classes or whether it's in the club. And thus, I do think that the club is a really good example for why diversity in DI work is so important. I know that these are terms that are on a lot of our minds in schools. And it makes me very happy to watch students from these different backgrounds and different experiences all coming together to play a game. I have also found in terms of our school culture that students are now gaming outside of our school, everything from D&D clubs to miniatures clubs. And they'll often come to Mr. Canarino and to myself, Mr. Klemenko and Miss Olson to ask us for advice on how to run things. And lastly, in terms of our impact here, I can't take full credit for this because games have been a thing in Hackley for a long time. But I would say that in the last 10 years, gaming really has become an integral part of our curriculum. I do think that it's something that gets highlighted in admissions interviews. Like I've received emails from prospective students that ask me about the program. I know that our head of school is always thinking about gaming in terms of our strategic plan and really sort of making our sort of school goal to continue this sort of work. And it is a topic of interest amongst our HPI, meaning our parents. And I will read a little note that a parent sent me once about, the parent perspective on gaming. And here it is. This is, I should say, a parent who plays a pretty big role at the school. And she sent me this email and what she was sort of talking about in terms of why she thinks gaming is important. And I would argue, by the way, that many parents hold this view. As a parent and also a clinical psychologist, I see particular value in Hackley strategy game programming. As educators and psychologists, we talk often about the value of play for younger children, for their academic, social, and emotional development. When children enter into the world of imaginary play, they collaborate with peers, they build their verbal skills, and through role-playing imaginary characters, they try on different ways of being in and navigating the world. But what happens to these skills and all that fun, or I should say, but what happens to these skills and all that fun when kids hit the tween and teen years? These skills are important for all ages. The gaming program is, to me, like a natural continuation of our human need to imagine and play and engage in the deep and rich learning that comes with it. Often there is the added component of world history and diving deep into particular time periods or global conflicts. My kids love it and love it so much that they will attend even if they don't know any of the other kids planning to attend. So as a teacher, I mean, you can't really get better than that. And I use the word privileged. I'm really privileged to be in a position where our parents feel this way about our program. What about the administrative perspective? Now, I want to start with sort of a quote from our upper school director. It's not an exact quote. I would say it's more of a paraphrasing because I talk with our administrators a lot about sort of our experiences, and there are times where they're sort of they'll sort of come in and kind of look at what we do. And one of the most profound things I've sort of heard from an administrator was, how did these kids remember all these details of what you're doing? And what that was in conjunction with is the fact that, if you ask students to recollect what they learned about Reconstruction, a really good student will probably recollect a great deal of it and sort of go through it in a mundane sort of way. Some students might not necessarily remember, depending on, how they are as a student or how they are as a learner or what they're learning in their class. With gaming, these kids take copious notes and they can just recount all of these stories that happen in their game setting. And again, it speaks to the fact that these kinds of activities really resonate with students. Now, going beyond that, and I've worked for a number of different administrators over the years, what they really like about not just game-based learning, but really the game club in general, is that it's a great way to build community. It's a great way to build school culture. Kids are not getting a diploma for being part of the game club, yet they come on Saturdays, they take time out of their busy schedules from homework and all the other things that they do to roll dice. And administrators really, really like that. Games can be a great vehicle to hear and understand many voices and perspectives. This is something that's really, important for many administrators. They want all students to feel welcome, and they should feel welcome. And again, sitting around a gaming table and getting to have conversations with students when they're having fun and they're learning, it's a great way to get people heard. Another phrase that you'll hear a lot in especially secondary education, though one could argue, the university experience as well, is really making learning student-centered. Games are student-centered. Once I teach them how to play, they go. Sometimes they modify rules. Sometimes they design their own scenarios. It's not really about me. It's about them. I'm just sort of providing the context for them to kind of get going. They say that classrooms are more dynamic with game-based learning. It seems like things are sort of moving in a better way than just having the teacher sort of go on and on and on about a particular topic, which, don't get me wrong, teachers are paid in a lot of cases, obviously for the things that they know. You know, we know things about the world, and it's our job to kind of give that information to our students. But at the same time, we want the students talking as well. You know, it's not necessarily that they are just simply vessels that need to be filled up. And final point about what administrators often tell me about, especially the game club, is that it's great for new students. It's great for them to help sort of integrate into a school where they might not know anybody, they're new, and gaming is a great sort of low-key way for them to get in there. All right, it is 7:02. I'm a little over, but I feel like you know, we're in a good place. We are now in the final stages of this presentation. I hope you've been enjoying it so far. Let's talk a little bit about HMGS, which is an organization I belong to, and the next evolution, which is called HMGS Next Gen, which was just founded in August of 2020. So HMGS is a society that runs conventions all across the country. HMGS has lots of different groups that operate in different parts of the United States. And it's all about miniature gaming, with a specific emphasis on historical miniature gaming. So things like Napoleonics, the American Civil War, the American Revolution, World War II, so on and so forth. And what I'd like to talk a little bit about is where Next Gen came from, how it sort of stemmed out of you know, the larger sort of HMGS organization. And I want to try to connect all of the dots about game-based learning, our game club, HMGS, and where we're sort of headed. So here we go. We're in the sort of ending stages here. So here is a question that has always been on the minds of miniature wargamers. Is it dying out? You know, a lot of times if you go to gaming conventions, and this is science-based, this is not just my opinion. You know, a lot of the historical miniature gamers out there that run games have been doing it for a very long time. You know, miniature wargaming has been around for a while, you know, since, you know, the early 1900s. But, you know, when you think about when it really picked up in the United States and overseas, you know, talking about the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, a lot of our GMs tend to be, you know, gamers that are in their 50s and 60s. And one of the questions that a lot of us that are forward thinkers have always sort of wondered is, how do we get more younger people involved? Because here's the sort of fascinating thing, and I could do a whole presentation just on this alone. Most game-related avenues are growing right now. You think about the impact of comic books and comic book movies, all the different kinds of fantasy-related shows on Netflix and Hulu. Gamers are really taking over the world. You know, nerds are really taking over the world. And for a lot of those kinds of games, whether you're talking about Magic or D&D or Warhammer 40K or anything like that, you have an easy in to find those miniatures in person, meaning you can go to just about any comic book store and find somebody that's knowledgeable about those kinds of games and immediately have a player base. Miniature wargaming is one of those hobbies that it's a little bit more challenging. There are some miniatures war games that are historical based that are sold in some comic stores, like Bolt Action, Flames of War, things along those lines. So not to be totally, I don't mean to be totally negative, but John Spees is the president of HMGS, and he is a real forward thinker. I don't know if he's on this call, he might be, but he and I have been sort of talking for quite a while about not necessarily harping on the negative, but sort of saying to ourselves, you know, how could we push gaming and historical miniature gaming into the sort of more mainstream and kind of help the hobby to sort of grow. John and I have known each other for a long time, but it's hard to remember the exact date. It's almost like trying to remember when you made your best friend, I guess you could say. It must have been the like 2011 or 2012 where John actually came to Hackley. And I started to develop a program where HMGS members would come to Hackley and kind of visit and actually be visiting GMs, run games for students. And what they noticed, John included, was, man, these students are amazing. They're curious, they learn rules quickly, they're polite, they care about the experience more than winning, they're interested in history, they want to be creative. And a lot of the GMs that have come to Hackley to run games have kind of left saying, when can I come back? When can I run the next game? How do we get these kids coming to gaming cons? And a lot of times they enjoy running the games for students more than they do their own sort of clubs. And John and I sort of said to ourselves, could the Hackley model be reproduced in other institutions? And I'll go over what I mean by institutions momentarily. This is where Next Gen sort of comes from. So not only did HMGS make a really concerted effort to start supporting school programs even before Next Gen was founded, but as time went on, we said to ourselves, maybe it would be more efficient to have a separate sort of organization to handle this. And that's where Next Gen comes from. Now, we are literally in the beginning stages of developing our programming and things like that. This mission statement here, I don't know if when our website comes out, if this is going to be exactly word for word what it will be then, but ultimately, this is the way I kind of look at it. HMGS Next Gen is the goal of funding, fostering, and facilitating the growth of game clubs, design thinking, and game-based professional development here in the United States across the world. This is our goal. This is what we want to try to work towards. And we're going to start in a small place and hopefully grow and grow and grow as time goes on. To give you a little bit more information about specifically what Next Gen is sort of planning and what we want to do, our target audience would be universities, especially university game clubs, secondary schools, everything from public to charter to private, library programs, and then the corporate and professional world. And we'll get to that in a moment, because that's a little bit different than some of what we're shooting for in some of these other places. Our goal is to meet the gaming needs of the institution. So for example, if a school or a university or a library or a business reaches out to us and says, we really are interested in gaming and we want to use gaming here at our institution, Next Gen's goal would be to figure out what they really need, and our goal would be to make it happen. So for example, does the institution need somebody to run games? Does the institution need help getting miniatures? Does the institution want support in getting game-based learning into their curriculum, or for example, into their workplace or work environment? When it comes to these three words, fund, foster, and facilitate, when it comes to funding, our goal will be to find the kinds of programs that need funding and be able to provide it, meaning, an organization wants supplies or miniatures or books or whatever. Our goal would be to be able to provide an element of funding so that they can make that sort of dream come true. Fostering means, let's say an institution doesn't have a game club but really wants one. The idea would be for someone like me or somebody that's facilitated together with the organization. And what we want to be able to do is sort of help that sort of growth, help them develop that game club and build a relationship with that organization. What about facilitating? So let's say an institution has a game club but needs support with events or just wants more events. So maybe a game club is really focused on playing a game like Diplomacy and they want miniatures but don't have them. We could sort of come in and help facilitate something like that. So these are all sort of goals that we have, and examples of some of the outreach that we've already done. We're working with the Yale University Game Club. We're working with Westchester Community College's Game Club, the Gardiner Library, which is here in New York. And in each of these cases, we ran different sort of activities that, the club wanted. So for example, Westchester is really interested in role-playing. Now, while HMGS is mostly focused on miniature gaming, we do want to branch out into other forms of gaming, as long as we're still incorporating some miniatures into the mix. So WCC played Dread, which we used as a way to do diversity work with their club, whereas Yale was really interested in miniatures, and I ran a virtual Jena-Auerstadt campaign for them. We're also going to be working in a more professional sense, I guess you could say. We're going to be working with WCC's faculty in March, in which we're going to do a presentation similar to this and give some of the professors ideas about how to integrate some games into their college courses. And another example of some of the things that we're doing is, again, in March of 2021, I'm going to be doing a presentation for about something like 48 or 50 library leaders in New York. And again, that presentation is going to focus on Next Gen and, you know, the different kinds of library programs that we could sort of have. Libraries are great and always have been a great community element in towns and villages and cities and things like that. So libraries are a great place, you know, for us to sort of push into. Now, I'm not going to read these testimonials verbatim, but what we've been having some of our players and some of the people that we've been working with, sometimes I use the word client, we might need to find a better word than that, but where we give them testimonials, you know, to sort of fill out. And it could be in some cases like, what was the game experience like? What kind of recommendations would you make? So you can sort of, you know, take a look at this. These university students really got into it. And again, they gave some sort of great ideas on how the scenario could sort of be improved. And it supports things that they're interested in. You know, these two particular students are part of a burgeoning club at Yale that really wants to play miniatures. Now, again, COVID kind of put a little bit of kibosh on that because of the fact that we can't be in person. But this is a great example of a group that we would love to run events for in the future, where one of our facilitators, myself or somebody else, you know, goes to their university and runs games for them and helps them get their own games off the ground as well. All right. And again, these are just some more, you know, testimonials about, you know, what the, you know, experience was like for them. So I'll just leave this up just for a moment. And to kind of get to a little bit of a conclusion, one final topic that I wanted to sort of broach was professional development and where Next Gen sort of sees itself in that sense. So one of the ideas that we have, and again, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody has done this somewhere, but I can't really necessarily think of any large organization that has necessarily broke out into the mainstream in terms of doing this kind of work. But basically going into whether it's a company or whether it's with school faculty, a business, you know, basically professional organizations that are looking to improve themselves and are interested in using games as that lens, okay? So one of the thoughts that we have is being able to go into a work environment and help, you know, bosses and their teams skill build, help them through games to handle real life situations, in some cases even hypothetical situations, especially hypothetical situations that, you know, could be, you know, real. Build camaraderie and teamwork and leadership. I found in the past when I've done this kind of work, and I'll give you one example in a moment, and it'll be a quick one. They're great icebreakers, you know, so for example, let's say we have new employees at a particular workplace using games to kind of get people to know one another. One example that I can give in which I and my partner in crime, Mike Canarino, when we went to the Nasaga conference in 2019, we you know, for the first time, did one of these types of simulations with adults, you know, people that were not even necessarily teachers, people who may be a game designer, and in some cases, people that worked in the corporate world that were coming to a conference like this in order to learn more about how to use sort of games in the same way that, like, if you think about like the 80s and the 90s, when outdoor education became so prevalent in workplaces. Like, so for example, you take your company out into the woods and you do team building activities. There are a lot of people in the professional world that look at games in that sense. So for example, you know, having a once a month session where everybody plays Settlers of Catan, you know, and you use those experiences to kind of help facilitate things in your job itself. So here's a quick example. You know, Canarino and I, we ran a simulation at this particular conference for about 30 or 40 people. It was called Drawing a Line in the Sand. It was a simulation about Popilius. Now, again, it's late. Without going into a ton of detail, Popilius was a Roman ambassador at the time of the Roman Republic who famously prevented a war by drawing a circle around a king named Antiochus, who was coming from Syria and trying to invade Egypt, which was the Roman ally. And famously, Popilius drew a circle around Antiochus and basically said, look, you know, if you leave this circle before giving me a answer about whether you're going to take your army and go back to Syria, if you leave this circle, understand that you're essentially sort of casting the die. You're rolling the die with Rome. And as the story goes, Antiochus shook Popilius's hand and took his army and went home. We took this and put it on its head. And we said, what if Popilius did this without permission? What if he went almost like a rogue lone wolf to Egypt and did this on his own? And what would happen if he was brought back to Rome and put on trial essentially by the Roman Senate? So even though it worked, how would Roman senators view this kind of use of power? So what we did was we turned this into a simulation where all of the adult players that were at this conference, what they did was they received a character from us, and each character had a gravitas rating, meaning how strong was their voice within the Senate. Their backgrounds also gave them a sense of who they were and what was important to them. And it's really role-playing. So what we were sort of trying to imagine is, imagine if you had a real-life workplace that was trying to sort of host something on leadership. They wanted to emphasize leadership in their workplace that month. Well, what if you were to take a simulation like this and use it to teach that skill? So what the players did was they were given this hypothetical or quasi-hypothetical situation. And what they had to do is they had to role play for about 30 minutes in which they had to get allies of people in the room. They had to gain support for whatever cause they believed in. And in the end, they had to prepare a presentation where they spoke in front of one another based on how they wanted the situation to be resolved. And in the end, a vote was sort of cast to determine Popilius's fate. The game mechanic of the game, beyond just role-playing, is the gravitas system, where each player started with an X amount of gravitas points to kind of represent their voice in the room. And you could acquire more gravitas by making a good impression on the people around you. And if those people were willing to give you one of their stickers, it meant that your gravitas rating went up. So lots of different sort of, let me back up for a second. You could use your gravitas in lots of different ways. And there would be lots of different reasons for giving somebody your stickers. It could be because they share the same opinion as you. It could be that you hate another opinion so much that you're willing to support somebody who is against it. And what we found was that it was really phenomenal. Players really got into it. It got heated at times in a good way, where these players got so invested in their characters and so invested about what would happen to Popilius in the end, that they were just immersed. And what we found in the debrief was the kinds of skills that were emphasized in the game could absolutely pay dividends in the work environment. And on the contrary, some of the players noticed what were the kinds of skills, what were the sorts of things that you would want to avoid? What were some of the tactics that some players use to get what they want? And how could you, in your work environment, make sure that those things don't happen? So in that moment, we were very, very happy with the way that everything sort of played out. And we believe that this could be another sort of facet of Next Gen, where not only are we working with running events and games and things like that with students, but rather also sort of break into the mainstream and really look at some, again, professional organizations and businesses and things like that that are looking for this kind of learning. And going all the way back to the beginning, because I'm essentially done here. I can talk to you about sort of our end goals, but this is basically it. The linchpin with all of this, whether you're talking about the classroom or game clubs or this kind of professional development with different organizations, the sort of thing that brings everything together are games can be a great way to further yourself and a great way to further your classroom or your institution or your workplace. Games is what brings all of that sort of together. Our end goals and long-term, at least for the time being, again, COVID has made this a little bit difficult, but essentially we are in the stages of getting a website up and running. We're going to continue working with the clients that we already have, and we're going to attempt to develop relations with other people. We do want to make inroads with the professional world, and we want to bring people together. We want to bring different institutions and different game clubs together. Whether it's for individualized events or a yearly conference where we bring everyone together. We can get guest speakers, game designers, bring some students in, and really put together a great program where everyone is learning from one another. And again, using games as that sort of tool. So at this point, it's 7:20, so I went 20 minutes over. I'm gonna hit stop share. And again, I'll be honest, this was a little weird in the sense that I couldn't see anybody as I was talking. So normally I don't get as tongue twisted as I think I did it a few times here, but I hope that overall the message was sort of clear about, what we're trying to accomplish with the organization and some of the things that we do at Hackley. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. We can do a Q&A now if you guys would like. And the floor is yours now with questions.
Yeah, so Jared, thank you for starters. I would dare say I think people were quite interested. We have a whole slew of questions, and I don't know if you got a chance to look at the chat.
No, I unfortunately didn't. All I could see was my own screen, so I was looking into the void, so to speak, to quote Black Sabbath. So,
but yeah, so we have a kind of a whole slew of questions, and I'm gonna kind of generally go just in chronological order. So,
all right, sounds good.
If there are any questions that other people have, please feel free to continue tossing them in the chat. But the first one is from Michael Dunn, and he asks, can you talk about what sort of faculty development programs that your school has conducted to educate instructors on how to incorporate gaming as part of the curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would answer that in a couple of different ways. So within our school itself, I'm trying to remember the exact time frame, about 3 years ago, I was approached by one of our administrators, a guy named Peter Sawkins, who had applied for a grant. And what he wanted to do at our school is actually, again, kind of use my knowledge and use Mike Canarino's knowledge and Emma Olson's knowledge and a bunch of other people and say, how could we as an institution incorporate more games into the classroom? And he's actually the one responsible for finding Nasaga. He's responsible for setting up some of the professional development opportunities that we had outside of the school. So what we did was we got a group of maybe 10 or 20 teachers over the course of 1 year, and we had monthly meetings where everybody would do different presentations on some of the things that they would do in their classrooms. So that's one way. And by the way, this is another element of work that we're sort of looking into, meaning we can do something similar to that at other schools. Now, the other way I would say that we at Hackley have been sort of educating teachers about this is, so for the last 3 years, I've run a conference for NICES teachers, meaning teachers that are in independent schools throughout New York. And the topic of the conference is exactly what we just talked about, like gaming in the classroom. So it's very different though. In a lot of ways, the way that I ran this is not at all how I run things. Normally what I do is if a conference is about gaming, we game. So just as an example, I ran the Black Death simulation game for the teachers years ago. And it's just a great way for teachers to get a hands-on approach to these kinds of skills. So we've run the conference twice, and I think if my memory serves me right, we've had about 80 different teachers from New York to come through. And COVID, unfortunately, kept us from running it again. But once this nightmare is over, the idea is to run it once a year.
Great, yeah, and I know some people had asked whether there were other schools with kind of similar programs, and I know you showed with the Next Gen slide, at least there's definitely plenty of colleges, and maybe GUWS or the Georgetown University Wargaming Society is kind of an example of that. But do you know just whether it's regionally in New York or just kind of nationally, are there other K through 12 schools or high schools that have kind of taken a similar approach?
So short answer is definitely. I am not a scientist though. I most of what I do is through experience. So I've never crunched the numbers or anything, but you would be surprised, and I was surprised at once you start really looking around, lots of different teachers have done this kind of work and do it. What Next Gen is trying to do is bring all of those different people together. So it's going to take some effort on our part and the community's part, because it's not just us. This is really a community thing. We're not in this to make money. I want to be really clear about that. It's more about finding all of those different schools and finding those different people and networking. And honestly, GUWS is a good example of this because I'm rather sure there are obviously gamers in here, so we can learn from one another, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So.
Great, thank you. And actually, one good question is from Donovan Lux. Donovan, apologize if I'm pronouncing your last name incorrectly. But just because I know a lot of people maybe who are in this webinar maybe have done GUWS actual kind of like simulations or war games or just other ones. And it can take, whether it's, you know, a few hours to a full day to a multi-day thing. So how do you deal with the time constraints of being in a classroom environment, right? Where it's maybe you have max an hour and then the students have to totally change tack and focus on something else.
Great question. Again, I can answer that in a couple of different ways. First, from an institutional point of view, I'm very lucky. And I think I've said that a few times. Our school believes in this. I could run a simulation over the course of 7 class periods if I want. Why? Because everything that I said earlier is true, and our administrators know that. I can cover everything that I need to cover, whether it's essay writing, verbal skills, discussion. I can cover all of that within the confines of a game, and they'll learn more. And I'm very confident in saying that. However, what if you are not in a school like that? There are always ways to pare everything down. In fact, I would argue that most people, even me, even before I started meeting other teachers that do this sort of same things that I do, I often think about games and simulations as long-term sorts of events. You could craft a great game that lasts a half hour. You know, I could have my students tomorrow run a quick role-playing simulation for 20 minutes and they can get a lot out of it, you know? So I would say that if your institution doesn't necessarily buy into it, you can find ways of integrating games, you know, into your curriculum. The other point that I would make as well, I don't always necessarily think that gaming is appropriate for every single circumstance. I would never tell a teacher that. Everything in moderation, right? Now that said, if you're designing a course specifically about gaming, that's an entirely different story.
Right. So just actually, there's a couple questions kind of on that point of buy-in. I know Evan D'Alessandro in the chat just had a really good one about, you had mentioned having other faculty observe or even playing in games. So do you think that them being able to actually see the gaming occurring rather than just kind of talking about it theoretically is part of the reason why your administration kind of has given you this leeway and basically how you've convinced them of its value?
Yes, it's like anything else. Watching somebody do something, watching student engagement is always far better than sitting down with an administrator or a boss or something and just trying to explain a game away. So yes, I absolutely think that it being so pervasive here where you can sort of see it is really important. The other point that I would make about this as well, because I thought the question was going in a little bit of a different direction. I sometimes find that teachers want to do this, but they get intimidated. So I would say it's almost equally important to bring teachers into your classroom to see how the games run. Because again, like, it's easy for me to talk about running a role-playing simulation because I've been doing it my entire life. I could do it with my eyes closed. And there's not much that I would brag about, but that is one area, like, I can run a pretty damn good role-playing simulation. But I have experience. So like, if you've never done it before, having that training is really important. And again, like, I just keep going back to the same point. When you're talking about something like Next Gen, if we come across teachers that need that training, my goal is to provide it to them. So.
And I know we had a question, an early question from Vishalji on just on student buy-in. And so did you find that there were that there are other difficulties with student buy-in, whether it's, I know one of the slides talked about how Prussia in a certain game seemed to be facing inherent difficulties. And so that, you know, maybe it's possible that just if a student's losing just at a game, or if it's not going well for their side or for whoever they are, that maybe they're less inclined to learn, or maybe it has the adverse effect, right? And it's kind of more competitive. So just
great question. So I've noticed both happen. And again, I'm just going to be super honest because I'm not going to sort of sit here like other presenters and say that this is literally biblical. Like, everyone will always have buy-in. There are some times that based on something that happens in a game or a circumstance before the game. And I can give you a super specific example of this actually that literally happened today. They sometimes can be dissuaded. So like, for example, the players that are playing Spain in my diplomacy game, they only start with 2 armies, whereas the other nations start with 3 and 4. I just gave them another one. So it's like important to balance out your scenarios just like you would be if you were running a very casual game of something. Now that said, I do find it more rare. I'll go into like some other reasons I find kids to be dissuaded, but I don't see that happen a lot. Usually the kids, they don't necessarily care all that much about losing horribly. In fact, I actually find that some of them get a kick out of it. So for example, that one of those students in the video that was sort of talking about her experience of playing the simulation, the Black Death game, by the end, they all kind of want to get plague. So even though it's a horrible thing, they kind of get into the sort of chaos of things not going well. And I guess I would argue, isn't that most gamers? Like, you know, I mean, I know some people who really get fixated on winning, but like, I don't know, there is something really interesting about losing or being drubbed, you know? But going back to kids maybe not getting into it, sometimes what I do find is if I don't, I'm speaking personally, if I don't put enough thought into the game, they can see that. Because if they see it as this is just a joke for us to have fun, that's sometimes where I don't see as much buy-in. Whereas it's like any other lesson, designing it well, where they see why doing all of the background work. So again, as an example, like understanding why if they're playing Clemens von Metternich, why they should know who he is. I think setting it up right is really important.
Great. And we had a couple questions. I know Brandon just asked one, and we had one a while ago from Rodney, just about kind of what you see in terms of gender and diversity from the students. And so this may be kind of limited to the student body at the school, but just between your classes and the club at school, have you, I know Brandon had asked, is gaming kind of primarily a male pursuit, and do you see kind of different levels of buy-in, whether it's male or female or kind of different socioeconomic or ethnicities?
So in addressing the question of gender, what I have found, and I would argue this is something that I've worked pretty hard on, some girls who identify as girls, they often tell me that they are into, hold on one sec, the lights randomly turn out, hold on one second. Sorry. When we role play, by the way, I have like a role playing group. Sometimes when that happens, it always sort of happens at the most inopportune time where it scares everybody. So hopefully no one got too scared there. Girls tend to be intimidated. What they get intimidated by, what they've told me, this is what they've told me. They get intimidated because they're afraid that they are going to be the only girl at that session and they're going to be surrounded by boys. What I have found over the years is that, generally speaking, girls are killer gamers at this school, especially in the middle school, because they tend, and again, these are very broad strokes I'm painting here, but a lot of girls, in my experience as a middle school teacher, they are a little bit more organized, a little bit more focused. And what I find is the boys that are playing the game with them benefit from them. They usually take on the leadership roles. And what I have found over the years is when I've had female students that really get into gaming, they serve as amazing role models to get other girls to show up. So again, is it still typically male-centered? Yes. But for the first time, about 2 weeks ago, I ran this Mad Max type sort of apocalyptic game at school, and there were more girls than boys at that event. And I think it's in part because 2 female students that are in the upper school now who have been gaming for a while and love it, they kind of put the call out. And because other female students see them and they admire them, and you know, one thing I didn't mention, it's usually like really savvy kids that like to do this stuff. These 2 students are like top of the food chain when it comes to academics, and they just drew people in. So but it is still a hurdle. And I would argue, especially in historical miniature gaming, it's a hurdle. I think it's better in other areas. I also think that particularly like role-playing companies are realizing, is it really necessary to put every female character in a player's handbook in some kind of chainmail like bikini and totally objectify them? I think a lot of gaming companies are starting to realize that that is not the way to go, especially if we're going to have more equity when it comes to not just both genders, but any gender, you know, to come in and game. So I know that was a little long-winded answer, but that's been my experience.
No, it's quite helpful. I know for our president is Caitlin Long is like a true kick-ass when it comes to wargaming. I
Awesome.
think could tell you enough about that. So just thinking of the video you showed of the kids kind of talking about their experience, we had a question from Milena about do you have any data, whether it's stats or just kind of anecdotal, about how the school's alumni maybe have applied their experiences in your classes to whether it's their jobs or their kind of post-grad experiences?
I don't have data. All I have are anecdotes. What I have noticed in, I would say, again, the game club was founded in 2008. So there's a lot of people at this point out of the school and in the workforce. What I have heard from students, and you know what, even just doing this presentation is making me definitely think about bringing somebody in to help us with data. But what I've sort of gathered is that a lot of game clubs have been formed. I don't know about their workplaces, but a lot of game clubs have been formed by people that have left this school, and in particular, students that leave Hackley and go to university, they form clubs there. That is what I've been told over the last couple of years. Now, I would assume that, and again, like I wonder if, you know, for people that are in this space right now, if you think about how being a gamer for however long as you have been a gamer and how that sort of impacted you in your workplace, I would assume that these students are being impacted. I just couldn't necessarily tell you verbatim what their answer would be, but I would surmise that it's happening. Think about it, like social skills, analytical skills, being able to get up in front of an audience and speak, all of that is part of gaming. So for a lot of our students, you know, that go into a more corporate world or become lawyers or things like that, and also lots of other kinds of jobs too, not just necessarily, because we do have a sort of a, you know, I mean, we're a private school, you know, so I think there is a little bit of a stigma of what that means. But we have people that go into all different kinds of professions. So I would assume that, you know, there's definitely some overlap, you know, when it comes to what they end up doing and gaming.
Right, and I know this is kind of another do you have the data question, but Dan had asked this earlier. Do you know of any studies kind of comparing the quote amount of learning gained from this kind of gaming or simulations as opposed to just a more traditional maybe lecture or seminar style?
Yes. Only thing though is off the top of my head, I don't remember the names of the authors, but again, a few years ago, we did some readings on this. There was one book in particular that did a great job of sort of showing what people take away from games and things along those lines. Actually, I can remember one specific sort of anecdote that the sort of book provided. I just can't remember the title. What I'll do is I'll remember it tonight, I'm sure, and I'll email it to Sebastian, and I'm sure we can kind of, you know, send it out. But this particular author was sort of taking a look at what happens when you have players that are playing a video game, which is not really my thing, but playing a video game where you're constantly leveling up and are constantly okay with failing in order to make that level, and what they retain from that, versus like a standard education, like where it's the same kind of deal in your classroom where you're trying to learn something, but the fear of failure is so unbelievable. And there were some stats that went with that. So like I said, I will find that author and I will send it to Sebastian, and I'm sure he'll be able to send it to all of you.
Great, thank you. So we have, I think it's 3 questions left, and they're all pretty kind of bang bang yes or no
Okay,
questions.
sounds good.
So while I ask those, if I've forgotten any questions to participants in the webinar, please do ping me, remind me in the chat. I know Kevin Kelly had asked if HMGS is recognized as a 501c3.
So as a nonprofit, HMGS Next Gen is a nonprofit organization. Yep. We have a bank account, we have funding. So yes, it is.
Okay, great. And Nathan in the chat had just a reminder, who was the person who had created those world building cards that you had used in class?
Oh, Trent Hergenrader. He is a professor at the University of Rochester. And I met him at a NASAGA conference, I think it was 2 years ago. He did a presentation as Mike and I were planning this role-playing course, and it was just like a godsend. We literally took those cards and brought them right into our classroom, because what we found was, yeah, I just saw somebody put in the chat. Yeah, he's got a website and everything. What we found was, and again, like, I don't know how many of you are role players. I love to role play. Like I run lots of different games and things like that. It's one thing for a narrator to describe a setting and describe a scenario and build a world themselves. It's another to bring the players into it. It's another thing to invest them in the process. And those cards set up an entire system to make it an organic process. So like, you'll lay cards out and, you know, one will say magic, one will say social services, one will say gender relations, one will say sexual orientation, one will say rule of law, and then numbers get assigned to them. And you use those numbers as a starting point to figure out where that civilization stands when it comes to that card. It's really awesome stuff. Like I said, we used it last year to create our world, so.
Yeah, thank you. And so I had just, I dropped that link just in case anyone does want
to thank you so much, Greg.
Investigate. So last question, and again, if anything pops in your head, feel free, please do drop it in the chat. But we had a question from Vishalaji, sorry, and who asked, would it be worth running games with your students over Vassal or a tabletop simulator? Especially, I don't know the extent to which you guys are in person versus just online.
Okay, so that's a really great question. And also, I can use that as a connecting point because I'm just realizing I didn't mention this. I'm totally down to run a virtual game for anybody here. You know, the original idea, and I'm glad that I remembered to say this, the original idea was to run it or have the potential of running it over the 27th and the 28th. What I'd be willing to do is just take emails from people, and then maybe if that date doesn't work, we could always find another time. So I just wanted to plug that for 1 second. But backing up, what I have found is that running virtual war games, there are a couple of ways to do it. I know that groups do like Tabletop Simulator. It's not the same thing as pushing the pieces in person. I also tend to run virtual games where I have a camera that hangs over the board, and I usually use a really small board and only a few units to keep things moving. And what the players do is they narrate to me what they want the units to do, and I have them roll dice and everything like that. So is it worth it? I do think that it is. And I do think that kids today, they like simulators more than I do. I'm much more of an in-person kind of player, and that's the way I like to run games. I think it's worth it, but I don't think it's necessarily as good as the real thing, because you're losing so much. You're losing the camaraderie. You're losing all of the random conversations that happen. It's just a little different. But if it's the only game in town, I do think that it can be worthwhile. The other point that I would make is if you're really into role-playing, I have found role-playing is pretty seamless on Zoom. In fact, I would argue in some ways it's better, because now you're not talking about having to schedule everybody to be at one place. Especially if people have things going on in their lives. It's just like you jump on Zoom for an hour, you run a couple of scenes, and it works really well.
Okay, well, so I think, fingers crossed, I believe I've hit all the questions. So Jared, thank you so much for coming in. It was a really great side conversation in the chat, and I really enjoyed the presentation. Definitely got a lot of people talking and thinking. So yeah, and to all of our participants, thank you again for coming and for being such a good audience. Sebastian, I think we're good to go. Jared, if you have any kind of last words.
Yeah, no, I'm just so happy that that people were here, that they enjoyed it. Like I said, I feel bad for stuttering a bit at the beginning. You know, it's weird to do these sorts of things on Zoom, but I really enjoyed it. One thing I didn't mention that I'll mention now, if you want to either get involved in Next Gen, if you want an event, if you just simply want to get involved, the best way to contact me for the moment is my actual work email. So that's jfishman@hackleyschool.org. You can easily find it online. And yeah, I would be down. I saw a few people mention like, oh, like, you know, I wish you could come to our school or something along those lines. I'd be happy to. That's kind of the whole point. And on that note, I'd be happy to bring you here when we're able to, because I'm sure there are really amazing people in this room that do things far better than me in a lot of cases. So especially when it comes to data and like gaming at the university level. So that's my last plug. So jfishman@hackleyschool.org. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, thank you.